Well, good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to the Korea Economic Institute of America. My name is Nicholas Hamasevich, and I'm Director of Research and Academic Affairs here at KEI. Thank you all for coming to KEI's Academic Paper Series event today. Our Academic Paper Series program consists of KEI commissioning up to 10 papers a year from experts and scholars on topics impacting the Korean Peninsula and affecting the U.S.-Korea alliance. The Academic Paper Series reports are then compiled and republished in the On Korea volume. So this paper will be published again in early 2015 in the newest version of our On Korea volume. For example, this is a copy of the 2014 On Korea volume, and it has all of our Academic Paper Series reports from the 2013 year. Well, today we have a great event for you. Just yesterday it was reported that South Korea will deploy a low-altitude radar system to help defend against North Korean drones. At least 4 North Korean drones have been found in South Korea in the past year. Alarmingly, one of these drones had been found in South Korea to have flown close enough to the Blue House in Seoul to record images. With these events and tensions still high on the Korean Peninsula, it is important to further examine North Korea's capabilities with drone warfare. We're excited to have with us Dr. Van Jackson to talk about his paper analyzing drone warfare on the Korean Peninsula and how the U.S.-South Korea alliance should properly respond to these new dynamics. Dr. Van Jackson is a visiting fellow at the Center for New American Security and a Council on Foreign Relations International Affairs fellow. He is also a visiting scholar in Georgetown University's Asian Studies program in the School of Foreign Service, and he teaches at Catholic University and the Naval Postgraduate School. From 2009 to 2014, Dr. Jackson held positions in the Office of the Secretary of Defense as Advisor for Asia-Pacific Strategy, Senior Country Director for Korea, and Working Group Chair of the U.S. Republic of Korea Extended Deterrence Policy Committee. From 2011 to 2013, he was also a non-resident James A. Kelly Fellow in Korean Studies with the Pacific Forum at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Dr. Jackson started his career in the U.S. Air Force as a Korean linguist and an intelligence analyst, and he has a PhD from the Catholic University of America. Please join me in welcoming Dr. Van Jackson.
Okay. So thanks, Nicholas, for the introduction. Thanks to KEI for hosting this forward-thinking, forward-looking event. This is not a common, normal topic, but it is very strategically oriented. It is very important, as I'll discuss today. So I'm very grateful to be here. I would say that we agreed there would be a fan on stage with me. I'm just kidding. So it's my intention that this be a talk today rather than a PowerPoint-based lecture. But I did bring some PowerPoint slides, just literally a couple. I think PowerPoint is a good way to distract you if I say something stupid, or to give you something other than me to look at. Also, I should note that I just had a baby last week, so I'm not on a lot of sleep. And as a result, I'm not fully lucid necessarily, and if I say something nonsensical, just look to the slides. But this is a very exciting topic. Hopefully you'll stay awake. Presumably I'll stay awake. And the fact that this topic is exciting was part of what stimulated the need for the research. So there's been a lot of media attention on drones, right? And there hasn't been a lot of analysis relating to drones. And so I started noticing that there was this major gap. On the one hand, you had this sort of breathless media coverage. It was almost a panic about the sort of existential threat of drones, the danger of drones, on the one hand, government statements even about the threat of North Korean drones on the one hand, and then on the other hand, you had some traditional security experts, retired military officers and the like, saying there's really nothing new to see here. the North Korean drone threat is overblown, right? And so this kind of raised questions to me, like why are knowledgeable people who are seeing the same set of events, like drone intrusions into South Korean territory, why are we at odds about how to interpret this and its significance? And I argue in the paper sort of implicitly that both sides of this emerging drone debate are wrong. Or put more diplomatically, both sides are partially correct. I think there's a gap in how to interpret the significance of drone threats and what to do about it, in part because there's no common framework. There's no mental model for how to interpret drone use. And so I thought that something useful to contribute would be, there's no, whoops, sorry. Not that it matters. Remember, the slides don't matter. I thought it would be useful to contribute my background in studying the history of North Korean provocations and coercion with my more recent background in the intersection of emerging technologies and Asian security to pose and answer, or at least try to answer, a basic question about when is North Korea more or less likely to use drones offensively, so to commit acts of violence against South Korea or the United States. Obviously an important question, obviously a question of concern, and when people weigh in and say drones are dangerous or the drone threat is overblown, implicitly they're answering this question, but they're answering it without any kind of rigor or analysis, and so that's what I was hoping to bring. I think that if we answer this question, we can, by definition, arm ourselves with what it is we need to better respond to North Korea's use of drones. And so what I've done is, this slide was supposed to be up the whole time, apologies. What I've done is basically generated a framework for how to interpret North Korea's likelihood of drone use for provocative purposes, for coercive purposes. And this framework is built on the logic of theories of reputation in international relations, and more importantly, on the historical pattern of North Korean uses of coercion. So I'm just simply taking this framework based on history and logic and then applying it to the new domain of drones. So to be clear, this is not necessarily a talk about the underlying technology. I'm a political scientist, I'm not an engineer, but it is a talk about the implications of this technology, how it's likely to be used, and what that means for Korean security, for Korean stability. And I think that's what we all care about, or at least we should, in my view. So it's possible that what I've developed in this paper that we'll talk about here is not the optimal framework for predicting North Korean drone use, but it's definitely a start. People can disagree with me. It wouldn't be the first time, surely. But the most important thing that I'm offering here is an answer to this question about when and why North Korea would be likely to use drones violently, because that's really what we should care about. So what is a drone? That's a reasonable question for a thing titled Attack of the Drones, right? So we're, of course, referring to unmanned aerial vehicles, UAVs, which are a type of robotic system. And UAVs, the spectrum of control ranges from fully autonomous, so pre-programmed, to remotely piloted, where it's basically a dumb hunk of metal controlled by a guy on the ground with a joystick. So all the functionality is controlled by a human still. And so that's the spectrum that we're talking about for UAV control. And the drones we've seen from North Korea so far have been a sort of low-tech version of autonomy. It seems like, this is mostly based on reporting in the Korean media, that North Korean drones have been flying pre-programmed routes using GPS. This is significant in itself because anything that's controlled by GPS has the ability to be jammed, right? And so that implies a way of dealing with the drones. As you can see in the pictures, though, these are not sophisticated devices. So they fly at low speeds, low altitudes, and they're quite small. So I mean, look at the size relative to Kim Jong-un. So we're talking as small as 4 to 6 feet. We're talking about 30 to 40 pounds. That's pretty tiny compared to a normal aircraft, right? It's tons. But these are also sort of best guess numbers. We don't have hard data about North Korean drones. And the reality is, just in the press coverage of North Korean drones alone, we see at least 6 variants of North Korean drones. You can look at the pictures. None of these things look exactly the same. And so that implies something about the performance parameters, the size, maybe the mission, the role that it has. And it looks like North Korea doesn't have a single type of drone, and it has many types of drones. Now, the experts who've dismissed drones as a threat, who've claimed that North Korean drone threat is overblown, they typically do this on the basis of what you see here. These are fairly unsophisticated systems, right? They say drones are crude, drones are unsophisticated. But to that argument, I would say the improvised explosive devices in Iraq were crude, were unsophisticated, yet it was one of the most devilish challenges we faced in Iraq. Billions of dollars to defeat it, and we still only were partially successful, right? And so a low-tech capability in the hands of a guy with bad intentions can produce very dangerous outcomes. And so the IED example suggests that maybe we should be taking drones, or not dismissing drones as a threat simply because they're crude or low-tech. Part of my argument is that's part of the challenge here, technologically. We're far superior to the North Korean drone, but we're optimized for a much better adversary than what we've got. And so we're not optimized for this low-tech, large, mass-based war fight that we could possibly have if we had to go into a conflict. And so there's also an issue with signaling and preparation that North Korea has done in this domain of drones. The North Korean military is exercising drones as part of joint force exercises. So you have humans, you have traditional weapon systems, and then you have drones all exercising together. You have media coverage of it. You have Kim Jong-un, as you see here, but there's a lot more footage than this, making observations of military drone units. And you have the Korean Central News Agency, KCNA, making statements about the intent to attack South Korean targets with what it calls, quote unquote, kamikaze drones. And so taken together, this is a lot of preparation and a lot of signaling on North Korea's part. And, I think that North Korea would not necessarily go to all this trouble if it didn't believe there wasn't some sort of advantage to using drones, to threatening drones, right? It's doing this for a reason. And so I don't think drones are a devastating capability in themselves. I don't think drones harbor the end of the republic. But they do offer North Korea a tactical advantage that it can exploit for coercive purposes. And I'll talk more at the end. These tactical advantages, especially this kind, can accrue to strategic significance, and we should be concerned about that. So in terms of what tactical advantages drones offer, particularly North Korean drones, they're able to evade radars designed for detecting much larger, faster, higher altitude aircraft, like we've said. They can perform a range of missions from surveillance to offensive strike, so they're agile. And they can deliver payloads on a target and then be reused, or they can be the payload themselves. So they can act as the explosive device to run suicide missions, which is what North Korea has basically said in its news, kamikaze drones for South Korean targets. And then, of course, as Nicholas said, if we're to believe South Korean reporting, there's been at least 4 incidents in which drones entered South Korean airspace. These are strategically significant areas of South Korea, and the South Korean military, the alliance, did not detect or prevent these. This is the media reporting at any rate. So if we're to understand that drones are another tool that North Korea can use for the purpose of coercion, and we want to anticipate when drones will be used for that purpose, my argument is that maybe we should be looking to the pattern of past North Korean coercion and situate our understanding of drone use in that context. So many of you probably know the history of North Korean coercion even better than I. The violent North Korean provocation category is very broad, but it encompasses everything from bombings and assassination attempts to naval attacks, aircraft shootdowns, and firefights along the DMZ. So the criteria for identifying a provocation is really, is this a violation of the armistice and is this an act of violence? And in the period from 1964 to 1968 alone, there were as many as 500 recorded acts of violence in violation of the armistice agreement. And so what's up on the slide here is a very small representation of that larger population, but it is representative. And so I don't want to talk through all of these, but just as an example on the first one, in 1963, North Korea shoots down a US helicopter. It takes the crew hostage, holds them for a year, demands a written apology from the US, and after a year, the US finally offers it to them. The US never makes any threats, it never takes any actions against North Korea, but it increases military aid, military exercises, it focuses on readiness. Ultimately, though, it gave in to North Korea's demand. So that's reasonable, right? You don't want to have a conflict escalate. In 1968, though, and maybe the room is familiar with this, there was something called the USS Pueblo incident, and it sounds remarkably familiar to this 1963 incident. What's even more interesting is that the following year, the Nixon administration had the exact same problem. And many Korea experts will say, oh yeah, the EC-121 shootdown. Well, that was a provocation too, but that's not even what I'm talking about. In 1969, this exact 1963 incident happened again. Downing of a US helicopter, taking the crew hostage, demanding the written apology. In the negotiations for the release of the Pueblo in 1968, North Korea referenced the 1963 incident as precedent. It said, look, you guys have given in to us before, just do it again, and you'll get your crew back. And so what this tells you, what this illustrates is the logic of reputation, but you don't have to engage in the theory to believe it. All you have to do is read the historical archives. And so, excuse me. And so there's a pattern here in what North Korea does, in the context in which it happens, and in the alliance response. Almost always, there's an overtly hostile context between North Korea and the alliance. In each of those instances, there is a number of threats that North Korea issues that are sort of mostly deemed incredible, and amongst those threats, there is a warning that violence is going to come in some domain, be it air, on the ground, or in the sea, and eventually North Korea commits an act of violence, presumably with a political end, and in response, the alliance invariably shows restraint or offers concessions through negotiations. In effect, it backs down rather than retaliate. And in the context of each of these incidents, that kind of makes sense because you don't want to escalate to a larger conflict. You don't want to make the situation worse. You don't want large-scale death, right? But that's a very clear pattern, and it's what happens over and over. And the only deviations from the pattern in North Korea's history are when the alliance took a firm counter-coercive stance in response to North Korean provocations, as in 1976, that was one of the only instances of this, or during periods of rapprochement, so periods of constructive diplomatic engagement where the motivation for provocations effectively gets put on hold or goes away. CSIS had this great chart that I don't have with me from a couple years ago where they basically looked at periods of the 4-party talks and the 6-party talks and then plotted on a timeline when North Korean provocations were happening, and they were always happening outside of the context of the 4- and 6-party talks. And so there are issues with how you code the events and maybe some of the analysis, but that larger observation fits the pattern that I'm describing here, right? And so, again, North Korean provocations are going to be less likely to happen during periods of sort of constructive diplomatic engagement, or if relations are hostile, confrontational, when the alliance takes a firm stand, effectively risks retaliation, right? And so I argue that you can make a more general claim based on the North Korean pattern of coercion historically. And that's what I do here to understand North Korea's offensive drone use. And this is based on my reading of the history of the archives. And I'm arguing effectively that North Korea's drone use will be most likely when the alliance maintains policies that are antagonistic or hostile toward North Korea, and at the same time, the alliance has either a recent history of backing down, of showing restraint, or the alliance has a recent history of bluffing, so making threats and then failing to implement them. Obviously, South Korea doesn't want to be attacked with drones or anything else. But given my framework for how we should be thinking about North Korean drone use, there is a set of implications that seem rather clear to me and that should inform what policymakers do if this is a problem that they're concerned about. And based on media coverage and investments that the Ministry of National Defense is making, I think the South Korean government at minimum takes this very seriously. And so the first recommendation relates to counter-drone capabilities and concepts. And the concepts part cannot be overemphasized. So we talked a little bit about air defense radars. They're usually optimized for detecting things that are much heavier, much faster, much higher performance. And North Korean drones don't fit that description. And so specialized radars are needed in order to identify and track North Korean drones. And the Ministry of Defense, if the Yonhap report is right, they're in the process of deploying this. I'd like to take credit for that, but I don't know if I actually can. But it's a smart move on their part. They need these radars to detect this specific type of threat because it's already started happening. Radars, though, are not nearly enough to actually counter drones. The argument can be made that maybe they're necessary, but they're most definitely not sufficient. And the reason is because drones have the ability to navigate around traditional air defense guns. They're too slow, they fly too low to use manned fighter aircraft against them. The cost exchange of trying to use cruise missiles against them doesn't make financial sense. They're dramatically different cost, especially North Korea's type of drones, which are particularly low cost. An alliance military doctrine has never faced an adversary that uses the concept of an aerial swarm, right? Almost nobody has. It's not even obvious what we mean when we talk about that beyond having networked teams of systems working together on a common mission with differentiated roles and being able to switch those roles by sharing information with each other in real time. So North Korea is not to that level of sophistication, but they've talked about it. They've said it. They've used the word swarm themselves. So this is clearly the direction they're saying they want to go. And so to really counter North Korean drones, the alliance should be, one, pursuing some type of drone commission or entering some sort of creative space where they can invest the time, the effort, the money to develop not just technologies that can counter North Korean drones, but concepts that leverage existing technologies and new technologies as well. The history of military innovation has always emphasized that you can't have the technology without the concept, without having it integrated into organizational processes. So these things go together. And so pursuing just a radar and thinking that you've solved the problem is not right. It's insufficient. And so I talk a bit in the paper, I won't do it here necessarily, about initial concepts for how you can counter the North Korean drone threat given additional potential technologies like radars, like alliance drones. South Korea is a big investor in drones themselves. And, you know, I should have a quick plug for my colleagues and I at the Center for New American Security. We've invested a lot in studying the robotics trend and its impact on deterrence, on defense, on the future of warfare in general. And Korea is part of that. And we're realizing that we're in the early stages of a renaissance for how militaries think about operational concepts for warfare. So drones are introducing a new paradigm for how we fight and how we think about what's necessary and sufficient for deterrence, for defense. And you see that with drones. It's drones as air and missile defense, drones for electronic jamming missions, drones that serve kamikaze, sort of suicide missions, deep strike missions. There's a range of possibilities. Surveillance, the ability to loiter in one area for a long period of time. And so we might be entering a new era, and it's possible that the Korean Peninsula is at the vanguard of that, because North and South Korea have robotic systems. They both have drones, and one of them is threatening to use them and has intruded the other's territory with it on at least 4 occasions in the past year. Now, the second recommendation is admittedly perhaps the most controversial of the recommendations in the paper, but it's also the one that follows most logically from the argument in the paper, from the framework that I present. And it's to build a strategy that responds to the historical pattern of North Korean behavior rather than a strategy that is reactive to events. All too often, we decide to pursue a strategy in the context of a crisis. By the time a crisis happens, your options have been limited. Circumstances have constrained you so that you have no appealing options. And so you're just simply reacting to events. And so with strategy, you want to try to get ahead of that if you can. And so a lot of critics have thrown stones at the US policy of strategic patience. I think in some ways that's fair. I think it's probably right in some ways. There are some problems with strategic patience. My concern about it is not necessarily the same as everyone else. My concern is that it's dissonant with the historical pattern that I'm talking about here in the paper, the historical pattern that I showed you on the slide from 1963 to 1968 to 1969, 500 provocations in a 4-year period. So like all of these things tell us something. And I think that strategic patience, it's created by Korea experts, but I don't think it respects Korean history. And I think that strategic patience, the way I interpret it, is pursuing a sort of antagonistic or confrontational stance with North Korea at the same time that you show restraint toward North Korea. So North Korea challenges you, I think Cheonanham, Yeonpyeongdo in 2010. Acts of violence, in the heat of the moment, you show restraint, you back down. And then you subsequently pursue policies that stoke antagonism, right? Sanctions, high military readiness, extended deterrence policy committee. I've been a part of almost all of this, by the way, so I'm not throwing stones from the outside. And there's a logic to these things, bolstering the military presence in the Korean Peninsula. There's a logic to this stuff. But that logic is a different logic from what we actually do in the midst of a crisis, where we're concerned more about escalation control, and for good reason. But if you're concerned about escalation control, if you're not willing to demonstrate resolve in the midst of a challenge, then it's bad strategy to then antagonize your adversary. It's the antagonism that, or from North Korea's perspective, let me not be too empathetic here. From North Korea's perspective, what we're doing is antagonistic. And it's that which motivates the use of force to achieve a political goal on North Korea's part. So if you take away anything from the talk, it's that you can't logically stoke animosity, rivalry with an actor that you're not willing to demonstrate resolve toward, because the result is coercive friction. It's violent provocations. So you want to know where violent provocations come from, it's from that duality, right? And so if North Korea conducts a provocation with a drone, even once, the likelihood it will do so again, based on my framework, is going to depend on how we respond to that initial challenge. And if North Korea's drone intrusions so far are a probe of alliance resolve, then our restraint shows a lack of resolve. And that is not necessarily a smart strategy unless we're also willing to be friendlier toward North Korea. And I would offer that a lot of people are not willing to be friendlier toward North Korea under current conditions. So the final recommendation may seem a bit off the wall, or maybe I'll call it novel. But the final recommendation is to monitor changes in the North Korean Air Force. So why the Air Force? Most air forces have strong cultural and institutional barriers to adopting drones in any significant way, like in a way that displaces a lot of the existing manned aircraft force structure. So most militaries, most air forces have this strong bias against unmanned systems, and that's just how it is. Most guys who run the Air Force around the world, or Air Forces around the world, they are pilots themselves. They grew up with pilots. They grew up knowing a certain capability that can be achieved when you have a guy in a cockpit. They know performance. They feel like it's low risk. A new technology seems risky. And you have really high sunk costs and long acquisition timelines with manned aircraft. They're very expensive and they're very slow to produce. And so it's hard to just flip a switch and say, oh, well, drones are the future of warfare, therefore we need to get rid of F-16, F-35, let's go get just a bunch of UAVs. That doesn't really make sense. That's not realistic. But for North Korea, these cultural, these institutional, these cost constraints are not the same. So the North Korean Air Force has equipment that's over 50, 60 years old. It's Soviet-era stuff. They have accident and maintenance issues that get worse over time. And they don't have the budget to replace old aircraft with new aircraft. And at any rate, if China or Russia tried to sell them new fighters, we'd be in that's a whole new geopolitical world right there. So not likely, right? So if you're the North Korean Air Force, you have to justify your existence. Air is a domain of combat. So what are you going to do? This makes North Korea uniquely open to innovation in the air domain. Will they exploit that? I don't know. But if they shift to a large-scale drone-based air force, that air force can potentially go from being one of the least threatening aspects of North Korea's military to one of the most threatening aspects of North Korea's military. So the alliance, as part of taking drones seriously, not panicking, but taking them seriously, should be investing time and effort into thinking about, what are the indicators that might be associated? What would we see if North Korea pivots its air force to be mostly unmanned, drone-based force structure, right? And look for that pathway. And if North Korea seems like they're on that pathway, then the alliance should be adjusting its capabilities and possibly its military doctrine accordingly. So there's much more in the paper. I glossed over some things here, but I want to leave plenty of time for the rest. So I'll stop now, and I'm sure there are more questions than I have answers. But
Great. Well, thanks, Van. Let me ask a couple questions, and we'll open up to everyone else. We kind of talked about this at the end, but do you think North Korea considers the drones that were found in South Korea as provocations and look to see how the U.S. and South Korea responded? Or do you think that they were just intelligence gathering missions? They didn't really expect them not to come back, and there isn't really much of a focus on North Korea on our response to the drones being found in South Korea.
So, is this on?
Yep.
Yeah. So, well, the short answer is who knows, but I think that what you see from KCNA, so how North Korea talks about drones, it's not an accident when they show Kim Jong-un looking at drone units. North Korea is not, an accidental policymaker. Like, they're pretty purposive. At least that's what I've always thought. And so if they're doing all this signaling around drones and they're building a discourse about the threat they pose with drones, maybe they're doing a little bit of chest thumping, but that's the context that I think should be used to interpret the discovery of drones in South Korea. So were they on surveillance missions? Yes. But were Chinese drones on surveillance missions in the Senkakus? Yes. That Chinese drone also had a probing purpose. So it was dual use within the military realm. Not that it was being used for commercial and military purposes, but it was being used for multiple types of military missions. And so I think that North Korea was probably probing, not necessarily the resolve of the alliance, but probing to see what the reaction would be. And then, by the way, if they get good footage of the Blue House or something, then that's like a plus.
Right. Okay. Is there any evidence that North Korea is thinking about UAVs or drones that are piloted by a human back at a base, or is that just too far ahead of the technology that they have right now?
So excellent question. I haven't seen any direct evidence that North Korea is interested in remotely piloted aircraft, but I could have missed. There could already be evidence, and I just haven't seen it. I was surprised that if you told me to guess what type of drone North Korea would pick, I would have guessed remotely piloted aircraft. That's what's easy to get commercially, and then it can be reconfigured potentially for military use. So it limits the range that you can fly drones at, because there's communication issues if you go to longer range. But I would have thought that the autonomous, programmed GPS guided drone would have been, even though it was crude, I would have thought that would be too sophisticated almost.
Really?
So,
that's interesting.
Yeah, I underestimated.
So the capabilities for that remotely piloted UAV are not necessarily so much more difficult than the autonomous, just pre-program it, let it fly, and come back.
Well, so there's high and the spectrum of control has high and low tech variations. So the U.S. operates remotely piloted aircraft. The Air Force does. They fly them out of Las Vegas or somewhere. And so you have certified pilots sitting there in a flight uniform with a giant screen and an actual joystick in a real cockpit, but it's not in a plane, it's in a trailer. And so this is very sophisticated equipment. It's communicating to a drone that's thousands of miles away, via satellite. And so this is a very high-end version of a remotely piloted aircraft. But the drones that you can buy on Amazon.com are also remotely piloted. And so there is a low-tech and high-tech version of every kind of control.
Okay.
And so North Korea is on the low-tech side of all of this, but I would have assumed that remotely piloted was the direction they would go.
Interesting. Okay, let's open up to all of you. If you could just please state your name, organization, and ask a question. So yes, over here on the left side.
I'm Peter Humphrey. I'm an Intel.
Here for you too.
I'm an Intel analyst most of the time in real life. I note that the simultaneous launch of 100,000 dumb drones, armed even with simple incendiaries or God forbid, bioweapons, is a weapon of mass destruction without crossing the nuclear threshold. And that's the potential here. But at this stage of the game, a couple of Zeppelins, a couple of blimps up along the border with high-frequency radars would catch every intrusion. And I'm a little surprised not to see that already. Just wanted to ask you, I know you're not an engineer, but let me ask you a couple questions. Do we have any feel for the download of these data back to North Korea? Have we intercepted that data stream? Is it all just photos, or is there some probing of radar response, radar frequencies? Is there stealth paint on any of the ones we've caught? Maybe you can answer some of those. Do any of them make it back to North Korea, or is it strictly a one-way trip so far?
So those are all interesting questions. I probably can't give a satisfactory answer to any of them. As far as I know, no. But I'm operating, I'm playing the same round of poker as everybody else. So I don't have access to special information anymore. My guess is no to stealth, because we just haven't seen it, otherwise. My guess is that some drones have, entered South Korean airspace and made it back, and we just didn't detect it. So how much is it a threat if you don't even know it's happening? I don't know. Again, I don't know. My guess is no. The stuff that South Korean officials found at the drone crash sites, it looked like it was just simple, like very crude surveillance equipment. They would pull, the tape recorders off of the thing when it got back to base. But the technologies that you're talking about, like using the RF spectrum, data streaming, GPS is not, these aren't sophisticated things. You can do, the commercial world already does this stuff. So North Korea's access to it is, it's not inconceivable that North Korea could launch much more sophisticated drones. And their signal, the thing that gets me is North Korea's own discourse around this. If North Korea said nothing about drones at all, showed no images at all, and then we just see them popping up, you could have a very strong debate, a la like the 1990s agreed framework about how to interpret this. But North Korea is telling us how they want us to interpret it, which is that it's a threat, which is they're going to use it as an asymmetric capability, right, to offset our military advantages. And so maybe we don't necessarily take everything North Korea says at face value, but we have to at least account for the fact that they're saying this. And so everything that you're talking about, including possibly stealth, it doesn't seem impossible to me. They have a high-tech ally on the other side of the border, and if China chose to, it could transfer certain technologies in a heartbeat. It wouldn't take much.
Stealth paint coming from a bottom.
Yeah. Yeah.
Any ship launches? Strictly land so far.
All I've seen is land. You mean launching the drones?
From ships, North Korean ships.
Yeah, I haven't seen that, but it's not inconceivable. We've shown that that's possible. Yeah.
Other questions? Yes, Mark. Right here.
Mark Tokolon with KEI. Has North Korea acknowledged those 4 drones were found were theirs? Second, do you know what laws or treaties violates to send small unarmed aircraft over a border?
That's an excellent question. On the second question, there's an international community of lawyers and scholars that are sort of in real time debating how international law applies to unmanned systems, especially unmanned aerial systems. And so, I'm not a lawyer, but my understanding is that it's very gray even when you get down to legal definitions of what you're talking about. And like the U.S., we interpret drones of a certain weight and payload capacity as cruise missiles. So it's not even considered an unmanned system, it's considered a cruise missile, or it's an unmanned system insofar as a cruise missile is an unmanned system. And so there's a lot of ambiguity and there's a lack of consensus about how drones should be treated internationally. And there has been a sort of nascent movement among NGOs, sort of a ban killer robots campaign. But they're not focused on the future of warfare. They're not focused on deterrence or defense. They're focused on the Obama administration's drone use in Pakistan, and where we're taking out terrorists and violating allegedly sovereignty of other nations. And so this is what they're taking issue with. And there's this science fiction concern with, nobody wants a Terminator running around. Like, I don't either. And so between the science fiction shadow looming and then the reality of drone strikes in Pakistan, Afghanistan, Yemen, there's an NGO community that's pushing to ban certain types of unmanned systems altogether. But my interpretation, a lot of my colleagues who work on this issue at a couple of different universities, at CSIS, at CNAS, there's sort of at least a DC consensus that it's sort of too late to ban drones entirely. Whether you think they're good or bad, I have sort of mixed feelings about it personally. You have to recognize that this is a reality. They've already started proliferating. 23 countries have armed drone programs. 30 countries, I think, are seeking to. In Asia, this is a big deal. I've wrote about it previously. This is part of like the strategic competition happening in Asia. And so the proliferation is happening, and to put the genie back in the bottle is sort of like wasted effort. And so the real question is, what is the appropriate like governance regime or approach to maintaining stability as these things get in the hands of more actors? Like, what's the best approach? And that's still up for debate, actually. People are making a living debating that right now outside of the Korea context. So it's probably not a good answer to the second question. I'm sorry, I forgot the first question.
The question was, is North Korea acknowledged these four drones are theirs?
Oh, yeah. I don't think so. Maybe others would know better than me, but I haven't seen them say anything about it.
Other questions? Yes, Ken.
Global American Business Institute. There's two questions. Is there an effective, cost-effective measure to counter drones? As you talked about, these weapon systems are very crude and simplistic, and it seems like, from a logical perspective, investing in a very sophisticated and a high-end countermeasure system is kind of useless if North Korea all of a sudden decides not to really use drones anymore, and we just wasted so much money on investing in a system that there isn't any use for. The second question is, you talked about that our resolve, we should have a firm and appropriate resolve towards North Korea when they provocate, instead of having a kind of showing restraint in action to a certain extent. But at the same time, what most Koreans and the U.S. government is worried about is, what if we react in the heat of the moment, and that situation escalates to a bigger conflict? Is there a sweet spot? Is there a type of response that we should be implementing that shows resolve, that shows that we are willing to keep our word, but nevertheless not go overboard?
Yeah, so those are both great questions. On the second question, there's this this paradox with deterrence, where you have to be willing to risk war in order to credibly prevent war, right? And it's totally manifest on the Korean Peninsula. And so the problem is we want to have our cake and eat it too when it comes to North Korea. We want to be able to show our displeasure toward North Korea. We are rivals with them to some extent, especially South Korea. And we're not afraid to let that hostility be known. We signal our displeasure to them all the time, and they serve as sort of subtle threats, right? And we intend these to be signals of resolve. But what happens a lot of times, it seems to me, and in some of the archives this actually does bear out, North Korea interprets these signals of resolve as the antagonism, the hostility, but it interprets the resolve based on how we respond to their challenge. And so we don't respond to the challenge. We react subsequently by providing, more forces or more exercises, or sending in a carrier strike group. And that's all fine, but our intention is that that carrier strike group signals resolve. North Korea's perception is that it signals hostility, right? And the resolve is judged based on, did they retaliate or not, right? Did they risk war or not? Did they counter-coerce or not? And so I'm not necessarily, this framework doesn't say we need to go onto a hawkish path with North Korea necessarily. And it doesn't say we need to go on a dovish path with North Korea necessarily. Like, both avenues are, you can construct plausible strategies that are hawkish or dovish. What you can't do logically is to poke North Korea in the eye and then show that you're not willing to retaliate if they push you. Like, if you're going to, thump your chest and yell at the guy, you have to be willing to push back when they push you, right? So you're giving them the motivation that they need to conduct provocations, justification, let's say. But whenever they actually conduct a challenge, conduct a provocation, we show restraint because, rightly, we're concerned about escalation. Like, what reasonable, actor wouldn't be concerned about escalation if it's not necessary? The sweet spot that I saw was in 1976 with the Panmunjom crisis, so the axe murder incident that people describe. That was a sweet spot, but it was very, very context dependent. We violated a North Korean threat, and then we dared them to challenge us. So we reframed the thing. Normally, North Korea takes an action, and it's almost like it dares us to react. We flipped it and reframed the coercive context so that it was on North Korea to respond. And then, as we were threatening a large show of force, North Korea, we had political demands associated with our action. So North Korea, Kim Il-sung apologized and then entered into sort of concessionary negotiations in the context of this show of force. But we had the political demands, and it was very context dependent. And so a lot of times now, we'll do a large show of force, but we don't attach political demands to it. It's a show of force, right? It's not a show of resolve necessarily. And so that's the challenge, I think. And then on the first question, I just don't think that conflict is very cost effective. So the improvised explosive devices in Iraq were so cheap. This is the problem. So like, everybody takes as conventional wisdom that there's this global diffusion of power. It's an assumption everywhere. The National Intelligence Council Global Trends Report talks about it. But nobody ever thinks about like what that means. What does that look like, the diffusion of power? Everybody still assumes the US is number one. And yeah, I agree, US is number one. But there is a diffusion of power. It's manifesting in technological capabilities that enable asymmetric advantages. So like technology can be used to nullify a traditional military advantage. And so everybody is still grappling with this, but it means that very cheap tools can be used to nullify the effects of very expensive systems. And so far it's just like with Iraq, the best way we know how to deal with it is set up $1 billion program and invest a lot of time and energy. But if it's preventing people from dying, like maybe that's worth it. It's not a very favorable cost exchange, but rational cost-benefit analysis is difficult in national security. So,
Yes, over here, please.
I have a question about policy question, not technical question. I'm raising this question because to my simple brain, I think there is a solution about how to prevent North Korea's further drone attacks, drone operations. We have, United States has much advanced technology with drones. And all we need is that if North Korea attacks again, we will send our drones to Pyongyang, close to Kim Jong, where Kim Jong-un is. We make that threat. I think that will work, but I'm sure that you're talking about the escalation problem. In 2010, Cheongnam, we suffered dearly. and we crumbled North Korea. But after Yeonpyeong-do, toward the end of that year, Defense Minister Kim Kwon-jin heavily warned North Korea that if you attack one more time, we will several times a heavier attack against you. And since then, for 4 years, nothing happened. So why don't we send a message? North Korea understands the message. So if we give them a sufficient clear message, they will not send. We can prevent them from sending drones to South Korea or any other provocations. We have prevented because of our clear message. We were safe for 4 years, and I think we can continue that. So my question, I should probably ask Mr. Obama or Park Geun-hye, but you might have some idea as to why they are not doing it.
So good question. I definitely can't answer for President Obama or Park Geun-hye. But so you're raising an interesting question about whether South Korea's threats since 2010 have been an effective form of deterrence. So it sounded like there was an assumption that deterrence worked. South Korea issued very stern threats, never again kind of threats. And North Korea has not attacked since then. The problem is that the ability to, like scholars have looked at this, the ability to draw inferences from past behavior is usually bounded by time. So the longer you go without establishing more history, the less credible the threat is. So it's possible that maybe North Korea believed South Korea's threats at first, but then it's been 4 years and there's been no new challenges, no new opportunities to observe alliance resolve. And so it's possible that North Korea doesn't believe the threats anymore, or in the future they'll stop believing them and they'll try. And so maybe the trying, maybe the probing of resolve looks like surveillance drones. You know, maybe it's less than violence, but they're just trying to see how we react. I'm making that up, I don't know. But it's not obvious to me that South Korean threats have prevented North Korean violence. It's possible, but it's possible that North Korea has decided that there's not a political goal that can be achieved with violence right now, but maybe later. And so it's your suggestion about sending U.S. or maybe South Korean drones into Pyongyang is quite provocative, but I don't know. Maybe it seems proportionate. There is risk in that, of course. There's risk of retaliation, but that's for not me to judge. It's that could be a reasonable course of action, but there's clearly risk, right?
I'm not talking about the sending, I'm talking about a warning.
Oh, threatening to send.
Threatening is next to the drone operation will be retaliated by our reaction.
Yeah. Well, it's probably better that I don't answer just right
Okay.
here.
Other questions? Yes, over here.
Phil Eskelin, also with KEI. Noticed in your paper, you said a lot of these drones may originate from China, or they have China components. Do you think the United Nations should add Chinese-made drones or to their sanctions list against North Korea?
Yeah, that's a good question. I ended up addressing that briefly in the paper at the end, but again, not a lawyer, but my interpretation of existing on the books UN Security Council resolutions are that even dual-use items are banned from sending into North Korea. And so drones, they can be used as a weapon. They can be used commercially. I think some of the drones that appeared that were Chinese manufactured were actually commercial use drones or civilian drones that have been repurposed for this surveillance mission. If that's true, then it seems to me that existing resolutions would already cover drones, and that if China is selling them to North Korea or giving them to North Korea, then it's violating existing UN Security Council resolutions. I don't know that a new resolution would be necessary unless China was interpreting existing resolutions differently. And so I'm just not sure. But that's a totally valid question. It's important.
Okay, we had over here.
Okay, my name's Diane. I'm also from KEI. I was interested, you talked a lot about deterrence theory, but the examples that you used were primarily of provocative behavior were from the 60s and the 70s. And I was interested to see what you thought the North Korean nuclear program and the concept of the instability and the stability paradox of nuclear weapons has on this sort of provocative back and forth, because there almost seems to be that there's an escalatory ceiling with two nuclear powers. And so it almost seems that at a point, our antagonism or their opinion of our antagonism doesn't even matter because of their new nuclear program in more modern times. So I thought if you could speak on that.
Yeah, so excellent question. So for anyone not familiar, stability and instability paradox, it's a Cold War concept that when you have two nuclear powers, they're both deterred from major war because of the mass destruction that would result. But paradoxically, that means that they also feel free to engage in lower level stuff. So proxy wars, coercion, this is how you can account for like Soviet invasion of Afghanistan, the Vietnam War. There's these small wars become more frequent and the big wars become implausible, right? And so if you apply that to North Korea as a nuclear power and the US as a nuclear power, the thinking would be that we're deterring each other from major war because of the cost of using nukes, and so therefore we should be free to engage in lower level coercion. So it's very logical. What makes me question whether it's valid now is because the United States is not engaging in small wars with North Korea. The United States is not engaging in coercion, but according to stability instability paradox, it's free to. Like you would expect that be happening. So it's one way to explain North Korea's behavior today, maybe, but if that's right, it strains to also explain U.S. restraint. Like why is the U.S. so concerned about escalation control, right? If we think North Korea is deterred from war because of our nuclear weapons. So I've thought about that. It's an interesting question. I just wonder how applicable it is given U.S. behavior, actually, rather than North Korea's behavior.
I think we have one more here. Yeah.
So I have two questions. So the first question, do you think hacking drones, because I've heard about some concepts of hacking drones, whether it was in Iran where they downed one of the American drones, do you think that's something that the South Korean government could look into? But also, putting in mind that these drones are very primitive and probably that would be even harder to infiltrate. My second question is, I'm pretty sure you're familiar with the Israeli Iron Dome.
Yeah.
Do you see something like that being implemented to prevent even small drones like that of getting across the border?
Yeah, so I talk a little bit in the paper about different kinds of nascent concepts for using drones as counters to drones, like how you would use these things. So it's very, very, cutting edge ideas. They're not all my ideas, obviously, but this is like a very new area. Because so far, most of the time when drones are employed, they're just employed as a substitute for existing manned systems, for traditional systems. And so the innovation, the paradigm shift happens when these things are enabling new concepts, new ways of fighting. And so it's not clear to me if an Iron Dome type system, which would rely on like missile interceptors or something like that, would be better than using sort of low cost but mass-based UAVs. And so there's concepts where you can use large numbers of networked UAVs in swarms to, and this is something that CNAS has been researching a lot the past year or two, to counter missiles, to counter drones themselves, to counter ground-based systems and sea-based systems. And so it's conceivable that South Korea will pursue some sort of Iron Dome-like solution. It would be a shame if they did not also explore through a commission or something how swarms of drones could be used at sort of low cost or reasonable cost to achieve similar effects. It's not inevitable that we would figure this out, and so there's some risk in trying to enter this new creative space for how you would counter a threat, but there's also high potential. And so to get to the cost-effective question, maybe that's a possibility. It's just not obvious. And then hacking drones is interesting. I saw a news report that drones have been hacked, like in Iraq, right? Insurgents have hacked drones. That's a little scary, right? But, you know, again, I'm not a computer scientist. So I'm not a computer scientist. I'm not an engineer. I'm not a lawyer. So it's not obvious at this point what I'm bringing to the table. But so with drones, my understanding of how hacking works is that you have to have some sort of, especially for a crude system, you have to have some sort of direct access to it. And to find it in cyberspace is, I mean, I'm talking way beyond my own expertise here, but to find it in cyberspace without having like physical access to it is kind of difficult. And so it may be really hard or impossible to hack North Korean drones, and it's made more difficult by them being very crude, very unsophisticated, and so it's, you know, it's not high tech. And so it's like trying to hack a 1960s Chevy or something.
Sure. Quick.
Question. So do you think, you've been talking about how the United States and South Korea will be working bilaterally as historically they've done in addressing this issue, but do you think the U.S. use of drones globally puts it in a bad situation in terms of this conflict? Because the U.S. uses drones, whether it's in Yemen, Somalia, Pakistan, in countries that are not have a war with, or just not pursuing war with, and is also is in suspicion of violating many international law. So do you think that puts that in a situation where it's harder for it to help South Korea with this particular topic?
Well, so I could see there being a perception issue because the moral hazard, the U.S. sort of, we've set a precedent maybe for this kind of, you know, illegal use. But that's actual employment. Where we should be as an alliance right now is just figuring out how to use these things, what needs to be developed and for what purpose. So, you know, we're not even really having those conversations. South Korea is developing stuff indigenously, which is fine. South Korea is partnering with Israel, I saw earlier this year. But there's not a lot of co-development or cooperative development in the technology itself with the U.S. And there certainly aren't discussions, to my knowledge, of, you know, rethinking operational concepts or, you know, how do you use these things in the context of an actual contingency? Like that, I don't think is being addressed.
Carson Menzel, you have a question?
Thank you. Don Manzullo. I was going to just say as a follow-up to Phil Eskelin's question is that it's pretty hard to figure drones into export controls. I mean, this is very simple technology. It's a glorified model airplane that runs either on a radio beacon or some type of a satellite signal that's controlled at a distance. And so I don't think that that's going to impact. In fact, your paper stated that that North Korea itself could actually build these drones if they wanted to. But what I just wanted to commend you is the fact that your paper is most unusual in that it takes a look at a new technology and tries to figure out responses that you would think the planners would already be engaging in, but probably are not. And of course, the North Koreans will have the opportunity to read your paper online and to examine and figure out what they're going to do next. But I think that this whole issue of drones is really remarkable because it's not a matter of speed or stealth. These guys move pretty slowly, sometimes 40 to 50 miles an hour, if that. In fact, there was something on YouTube, I believe 2 weeks ago, where some goose or duck encountered a drone that had a camera on it, and the animal won. I don't know if it was attacking the drone or what happened on it, but what makes the whole issue of drones particularly chilling is the fact that it's a whole new genre of espionage. The issue is not the drone itself, but the sophistication of the cameras that are attached to the underbelly of the machine and how far they can perceive and what they could look through. And so I want to thank you on behalf of KEI for coming and sharing your paper with us.
Yeah, no, thank you. I don't remember if I said this in the paper, but it doesn't strike me that export control policy is any kind of answer to this kind of threat. I don't know that proliferation is already happening, and so to restrain future U.S. exports simply makes the U.S. less competitive in this space. There are plenty of substitute actors who are able to sell and transfer and develop this stuff, which is evidenced by the fact that South Korea is not partnering with the U.S. to co-develop drones right now. And so export control is important in certain categories of weapon systems. I don't think it's appropriate for the Korean drone threat as a tool necessarily. And yeah, we may be in a new type of paradigm for how espionage happens, how wars are fought, how rivals interact with each other. This is a different kind of tool than what we've had for a long time. It's smaller, harder to detect. So.
We'll go right here. And then go. Yes, please.
Sarah Ahn, U.S. Korean student at Johns Hopkins University. I know that your paper focuses on the drone warfare itself, but I'm just wondering if you have ever thought of I'm just curious about your thoughts on in what circumstances North Korea will more likely engage in drone-based provocation versus other types of provocation, such as like missile attacks or conventional warfare.
Yeah, Nicholas and I were talking about this a little bit before this started. North Korea has a tendency to, I call it designing around deterrence. So you draw a line, you make a threat, right? And it's with respect to something specific. And so once that line is established, North Korea doesn't necessarily just cross it. They find some sort of nuanced way to violate, to challenge. And so they know that they cannot be killing Americans. They know this from the 1970s. They killed Americans in the 50s, in the 60s, in the early 70s. 1976, it became abundantly clear based on alliance actions that they could not kill Americans. And then they pivoted off of that kind of approach to sort of asymmetric and guerrilla warfare with South Korea. South Korea became more of a target, frankly. It was in the 80s that you started seeing like the bombings. 70s, there was assassination attempts. So 68 as well. And so there's this tendency to, you drew a line in the sand. You established a red line. Maybe we'll violate it, but in a sort of indirect way. And so drones are useful for that because it's a new area to sort of probe, alliance, resolve. We have not made threats with regard to drone use. Should we? I don't know. Maybe that's too much. But it's from North Korea's perspective, it's clearly an area where there's a lack of precedent. And for now, that applies to drones, but that same logic applies to any sort of emerging technology. And so, like between China and Japan with the Senkakus, it was a similar dynamic. So you have a rivalry context, and China used drones as a way to probe the resolve of Japan. It's the same reason why China, when it asserts itself in the East or South China Sea, it's not using the PLA Navy, it's using Coast Guard, it's using fishing vessels. These are indirect challenges, right? That on some level, everybody understands if you send a Navy in to do a traditional or a conventional operation, everybody knows what that means. The line is understood, and that is a high risk of escalation. But you can lower the risk if you're doing something, designing around that deterrence by doing something more ambiguous. So China has done it to Japan. North Korea does it all the time. Cheonhan in March 2010 was obviously very different from Yeonpyeong-do in November 2010. And so there's an evolution that sort of, it looks like North Korea is reacting to what the alliance is doing. So if we draw a line, then they will just go around it. That's my impression anyway. People interpret this stuff differently.
Other questions? Yeah, right here, please.
My name is Sung Young Ro. I just arrived from Korea 2 months ago, so I apologize my poor English. I fully agree with your viewpoint. As you see, the Korean drone is a kind of a new kind of threat of provocation toward South Korea. As you see, in terms of between the relations, U.S. and North Korea, the drone is very insignificant matter. But in terms of Korean people, it is very great threat toward our security. I work for Korean government. I got some very sensitive information about this drone, but I can't tell you fully. But I can tell you just a little. This drone is made of kind of painted how can I say?
Radar?
Yeah, anti-radar painter, and it also camouflaged with blue and white. Looks like
The sky.
the sky. And it also programmed to fly back to its base. So before we found that drone, we didn't ever think about that kind of threat. We just focus about their traditional military threat or some kind of a nuclear, something like that. But this is a new kind of threat toward us. Assuming that the drone was originally programmed to fly over Blue House, then go back to Pyongyang or some military base. If they succeeded, we ever didn't know what's their intention. But luckily, the drone was fall down to North Korean territory. At first, we didn't know who made this drone or what's the intention. But luckily, a week or later, another drone was found in another place, as you see. So we got some information about it might be from North Korea. Then we have some kind of new threat from that information. From then, we are now trying to find some countermeasure about the drone. As you see, although we are very well prepared for the kind of high-tech military weapon, but this is very low technology, but it nullified high-tech defense system. It verified. So I really agree with your viewpoint. So I want make your paper give some aid or some guide to other American or Western people to understand our Korean situation. That's my point.
No, thank you. Well, first, I would say that your English is just as good as mine. But, you know, this is the kind of issue that, if I had to guess, is not on the agenda for the 2+2, for the security consultative meeting, but it should be. You know, I've been in that position before. The policymakers are forced to be very reactive to events, and the agenda for these meetings is often established well in advance, and so it's difficult to insert a new or strategically important issue on the agenda unless it's some kind of crisis or it serves a specific interest of either side. But in those venues or in a separate venue, the Alliance should be having sort of strategically relevant discussions that are separate from the normal policy events and crises, and thinking about the future. And I think drones are a big part of that. Yeah, I think you described it pretty accurately. It's not the end of the world, but this is a challenge that the Alliance is not fully optimized for.
Other questions? Maybe one more for you, man. You're talking about how, especially in the Air Force, that North Korea might be more adaptable to the drones coming in. How much, you know, we kind of think of, and part of that designing around deterrence, some of the asymmetric, or we perceive it as asymmetric warfare that North Korea is doing. How much of that dynamic where North Korea is thinking about asymmetric warfare helps them incorporate or be more capable of incorporating drone warfare and drone type provocations or uses into their overall strategy? How much, since they already have that kind of somewhat thinking on those type of things, that they have to think about things differently because of their capabilities and dynamics and designing around deterrence, that now, okay, we have a new thing, we can more easily think about it.
Yeah, so military innovation in general is born most easily, innovation is not easy, but most easily out of necessity or failure, especially repeated failure. So, you know, the NACAF, the North Korean Air Force, has sort of arguably repeated failure with maintenance issues, right? With the inability to field a modern Air Force. Out of necessity, they have a standing organization dedicated to defense and offense in the air domain, just like almost every other country on Earth. But it has limited capability, so of necessity, its incentives would push it toward drones. Whether it does that or not, whether this is just empty signaling or not, like all that's less clear. But it seems like when you look across the world of nations interested in drones, North Korea is uniquely able to sort of pivot its own force structure, its own air force to embrace it, where others have a lot of barriers and a lot of historical baggage and equipment that it's not ready to get rid of, right? So North Korea is kind of unique in that way.
Please join me in thanking Dr. Van Jackson for a great discussion.